There is a quiet moment in life when you notice you've stopped explaining yourself. Not intentionally, not as a decision. It simply happens. One conversation, one reaction, one silence at a time. You say less not because you have nothing to say, but because you've begun to understand who is actually listening. If that shift feels familiar, stay here for a while. There's more behind it than it first appears. For much of life, explaining ourselves feels necessary. We clarify our choices, defend our intentions, soften misunderstandings. We want them to be seen accurately, understood fully, accepted without distortion. And for years, that effort feels justified. Relationships seem to depend on it. But over time, something begins to change. Not all at once, not dramatically. It begins in small moments, when you explain something carefully, and it's still misunderstood. When you clarify your intentions, and they're still questioned. When you open up, and it's received with indifference. Or worse, reshaped into something unrecognizable. At first, you try again. You explain better. You choose your words more carefully. You give more context, more patience, more effort. But eventually, a quiet realization begins to form. Not everyone misunderstands because they lack information. Some misunderstand because they've already decided how they see you. And once that realization settles in, something inside you starts to adjust. You begin to notice how often you are repeating yourself, not in words, but in meaning. The same explanations, the same clarifications, the same attempts to bridge a gap that never quite closes. And slowly, you begin to ask a different question. Not, how can I explain this better? But why am I explaining this at all? That question doesn't lead to an immediate answer. It lingers. It follows you into conversations, into quiet moments, into reflections you didn't expect to have. And over time, it changes how you show up. You start to pause before responding, not out of hesitation, but out of evaluation. Is this a moment that requires your explanation? Or is it a moment that will simply absorb it without understanding? And when the answer becomes clear, something shifts. You say less, not in a defensive way, not in a withdrawn way, but in a deliberate way. You begin to realize that explanation is a form of energy. And like all forms of energy, it has limits. One of the first places this becomes visible is in familiar relationships. The ones that have history, patterns, expectations. You may notice that you no longer rush to correct assumptions. When someone misinterprets your decision, you don't immediately step in to clarify. When your silence is misunderstood, you don't always fill the gap. At first, this can feel uncomfortable. There's a lingering instinct to fix the misunderstanding, to restore the image, to make things right. But alongside that instinct, there's a growing awareness. Not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected. Some reveal more than they distort. You also begin to notice how differently people respond when you stop explaining. Some grow curious. They ask more, listen more carefully, try to understand. Others become distant, not because you've changed, but because your silence no longer supports their assumptions. And in that contrast, something becomes clearer than it has ever been. Who values understanding, and who is only comfortable with the version of you that required explanation. If you've ever found yourself thinking back to times when you tried harder, when you explained more, adjusted more, gave more than was returned, pause there for a moment. Let that memory settle, not with regret, but with recognition. Notice how much effort it took. Notice how little it changed. And then notice what that realization does to you now. Because this is where the shift deepens. You begin to understand that being understood is not something you can force. It's something that happens naturally in the presence of the right people, and rarely happens at all in the presence of the wrong ones. That understanding doesn't make you distant, it makes you selective, and that selectivity begins to shape everything. Conversations become quieter, but more meaningful. You speak when there's a space to be heard, not just when there is silence to fill. You explain when there is genuine curiosity, not when there is judgment waiting for confirmation. There is also a subtle change in how you handle being questioned. In the past, questions might have felt like invitations, to share, to connect, to clarify. But now you begin to distinguish between questions that seek understanding and questions that seek control. And you respond differently to each. To the first, you remain open. To the second, you no longer feel obligated to turn every question into an explanation. This doesn't mean you become closed off. It means you become intentional. Another pattern begins to emerge in how you reflect on your own choices. Without the constant need to explain them to others, you begin to sit with them more deeply yourself. You examine them not for approval, but for alignment. Does this feel right to me? Is this consistent with who I've become? Those questions start to matter more than external validation. And slowly, almost quietly, your confidence begins to change shape. It becomes less visible, but more stable. Less expressive, but more grounded. You no longer need others to confirm what you already understand. And that shift, though subtle, alters how you move through the world. If this reflection is bringing something to the surface for you, something you haven't quite named before, stay with that feeling. It's not accidental. Sometimes, what we stop doing reveals more than what we start. Because what you're letting go of is not communication. It's unnecessary justification. And what replaces it is not silence. It's clarity. As this clarity settles in, another realization begins to take form. One that is less about others and more about yourself. For years, explaining yourself may have felt like a way of maintaining connection, a way of keeping relationships stable, predictable, intact. But over time, you begin to see that constant explanation can also create a quiet imbalance, one where you are always adjusting, always translating, always meeting others halfway, while they remain where they are. And once you see that pattern clearly, it becomes difficult to return to it unconsciously. You begin to recognize how much of your energy was spent not just on being understood, but on preventing misunderstanding, anticipating reactions, softening truths, choosing words that would be more easily accepted. But in doing so, something else was happening. Parts of you were being edited, not removed, but reshaped. And over time, that reshaping creates a subtle distance, not between you and others, but between you and yourself. This is where the deeper shift begins. You start to reclaim that space, not by speaking louder, but by choosing when not to explain. If this resonates with a memory, perhaps a moment when you held back an explanation and felt both uncomfortable and strangely at peace, pause there. That moment matters, because within it is a realization that often takes years to fully understand. You don't lose connection by being less available for explanation. You lose illusion, and in its place, something more honest begins to grow. Relationships that depend on constant clarification begin to thin. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but gradually. And what remains are connections that require less maintenance, less translation, less effort to sustain. These are the relationships where silence is not misinterpreted, where decisions are not constantly questioned, where your presence is not dependent on your ability to explain it. And once you experience that kind of connection, even briefly, it becomes difficult to accept anything less. You may also notice a change in how you handle being misunderstood. It no longer carries the same urgency. It may still register, still feel uncomfortable, but it doesn't define the moment. You allow it to exist without immediately correcting it, because you've begun to understand something that is both simple and difficult to accept. Being misunderstood is not always a problem to solve. Sometimes it's a reality to accept, and in accepting it, you free yourself from a cycle that once felt necessary. As this continues, your sense of self becomes less reactive, less shaped by external perception, more anchored in internal consistency. You know who you are, not because it's been confirmed repeatedly, but because it no longer needs to be. And that knowing brings a different kind of quiet into your life. Not the silence of withdrawal, but the silence of certainty. If you've stayed with this reflection until now, then perhaps you've already felt that shift beginning somewhere within you. Growth logic. Thanks you for listening and being part of this reflection. There is no urgency to fully understand it today. Some changes are meant to unfold slowly, becoming clearer not through explanation, but through experience.